Thank you so much, Melsa. And I'm honoured that Melsa's husband, John, actually read my book. That's fantastic. First of all, I have an apology to make. I have been to Turkey many times, and I have many Turkish friends who actually say that I look Turkish, but I can't speak any Turkish at all. I now know one word, which is carbon. That's I can say. Thank you. So thank you very much, and please bear with me. And also, I apologise that I'm a man, but I was in climate change for quite a long time ago. Right. So I've just published this book. It's a fantastic book. You must all go out and buy it. In fact, even better, if you could write to my publisher and say, please translate it into Turkish, that would be really good. Really good. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about the context and the Carbon Disclosure Project. When I started working with the Carbon Disclosure Project, or CDP as it is now, there was just Paul Dickinson, who you saw, and his colleague Paul Simpson and me in a basement in London, and that was about 15, 20 years ago. And so now that it's grown to such an enormous size and influence is very amazing and wonderful. So if anyone asks you to start a new venture which has got no money and in a basement, then this is what can happen, right? And that's fantastic. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the Turkish context, because I understand that Turkey has introduced a new pension system where people are auto-enrolled into a pension. I mean, you know this better than me. But that will set Turkey on a new path towards what I call stakeholder capitalism. Because when large proportion of the population contribute even a small amount into a pension, these funds rapidly build up. And so you have this big pool of capital which owns the shares of all the companies in the country. And what we have in the UK, we've had this system for a long time, and so the US has as well. And it's very good in many ways, but it's also problematic in many ways. And it has the ability to actually solve the climate change problem, but it needs to be adjusted. And I want to talk a little bit about its problems and how potential solutions. So one of the good things it produces is things like CDP, which is about disclosure. Investors started off investors' rights to the companies they own and get them to disclose their carbon emissions, as you all know. And that's really good because it actually highlights what we need. We can now understand where the carbon emissions come from, so we can manage them. There's pressure from investors for companies to reduce their emissions. It motivates companies because, for example, we saw that many Turkish companies are now A-listers, and other companies want, their competitors want to compete, saying, why is my competition here and not me, and realise that they can reduce costs by reducing their carbon emissions and reduce the risk available to them. And also it shows up that in Turkey, I understand, the private sector is leading the fight against climate change. It's investing heavily in renewable energies. The country, for many reasons, might be pulling out Paris, but that doesn't stop the fact that the private sector are involved. And the same in the USA. The USA government has decided it's about Paris, and for very different reasons, I understand. But lots of private companies are saying we want to be part of the climate solution, right? So just I'll talk a bit about now about how my book relates to this. So I start with this picture, which is of a Mayan temple in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. So the Mayans civilization collapsed 1,000 years ago. So, but just before the collapse, they built this temple. So what's the purpose of this temple? Well, it was actually an attempt to stop climate change, because they were run by priests who believed that if they sacrificed people on these temples, then that would make the gods happy, and therefore the gods would keep providing good weather for the crops, right? So this is exactly what we do too. We have, these are our temples. We have priests in them who try to stop climate change by directing our resources, right? By different, they also use complicated mathematics, just like the Mayans, really different. And the problem we have is this. This shows that we're rapidly approaching, and at an increasing rate, the 1.5 degrees centigrade threshold, which governments are trying to work towards. And then once we've hit that, we'll hit the 2-degree threshold, which everyone thinks is actually dangerous, right? And it's speeding up. So what we have to do is rapidly invest in low-carbon technologies and also shut down all of our high-carbon production, right? And to do that, we need massive investment. So I can't see from here. So on the far left, the slide, the light blue graph is the actual required annual investment to avoid climate change globally, and the bar next to it is what is actually being invested in low carbon solutions, which is quite a large amount. I think it's $400 billion a year, but it's much smaller than what is required. But it's also smaller than government subsidies for fossil fuels. It's much smaller than fossil fuel investment. So although we need to actually shut down our existing fossil fuel and replace it by low carbon, although we're investing heavily in low carbon, we're investing more heavily in fossil fuels, and this is being subsidized by governments, right? And just to put this in context, on the right-hand chart bar is what the US government has spent annually on its F-35 fighter jet, one fighter jet, over 1 trillion, half of what is needed globally for climate change on this thing. Apparently, this F-35 fighter doesn't even work. It can't fly in the rain, which fortunately the US has no plans to attack Britain because then it wouldn't work, because it always rains in Britain. So saying that it's actually something that's a bit irrelevant to the world is US government's prepared to spend a huge amount, but in the fight against climate change, which might cause massive damage to our planet, the amounts invested are very small. But we're talking about finance here. So the amount that is required to transform to a low-carbon economy is actually achievable, because on the right it shows, for example, the size of the bond market, which is over twice of what we need to do. So the money is there, but it would require a huge shift to meet our needed targets. Right? So what's the financial sector doing at the same time? Well, this graph shows the financial sector is growing enormously. Since over the last 50 or 60 years, it's quadrupled in size relative to GDP. This is in the USA. And also it's doing lots of things which aren't obvious that they're of much use, right? So, for example, this is the growth in the over-the-counter derivatives market, which has sort of gone up 1,000 times. So it's not obvious how this relates to investment in climate change, for example. Right? So what is finance? Well, finance, this is why it's so crucial. When, as a society, as an economy, has a surplus, finance is the means by which it channels that surplus back to invest, either via banks or via savings like pension funds. And that investment is required for the economy to grow, because our surplus is channeled into things like new businesses and infrastructure like housing and bridges and railways and things, right? So that's what finances does. So it plays this crucial role, and it plays this crucial role if we need to transfer to the low carbon economy, because we need to shift that our surplus to be invested in low carbon, right? And finance relates to I like this pyramid is quite, it's not obvious to people working in finance how this works, but for example, over hundreds of years we've invested in fossil fuels, and fossil fuels have employed people and contributed to our wealth, so that impacts the economy. Because if you think about fossil fuels enable people to drive cars and think how that's impacted society, but it's also causes climate change, which damages the natural world. And there's this feedback loop whereby you have climate change. For example, you have hurricanes in Houston, which make people homeless, they damage the economy, and then it has a financial impact on the finance system, for example, through insurance, right? And we in Britain and in the USA, and also globally, we believe in the free market. So this surplus is allocated by the free market, and we think Turkey doesn't entirely have this system, but as it moves towards this new pension system, this is more and more going to happen. So the free market magically allocates capital to who needs it, and this works through economic theories which are translated into regulation and practice. And so, for example, we talked about index funds. Melsa talked a bit about index funds in Paris, and this is index funds exist because of the economic theory, which is called capital capital asset pricing model. The way finance works is an enactment of economic theory. But I wanted to, the contradiction here is that the financial, if we think about pensions, all the largest pension funds in the world are actually government funds. If we think about the pension system in Turkey, an individual puts in 10% of their income, and then the government puts in 25% of their income. So most of the contribution is from a government, and also the government, they then go on to invest government bonds, and the government set the interest rate. So although it's supposedly a free market, it only exists, and it's run and regulated by governments as if it were a free market. So going on to what happens in Britain and the USA with this system, if all the pension investment in Britain, less than 4% actually goes into useful things like building infrastructure or used by companies. I can't go into why this happens, but basically most of the investment goes into financial assets which are never used by the economy. And this is a problem, because if we remembered my graphs before of how much money we need to invest in a low-carbon economy, if most of this is being captured by the financial system itself, it's not going into a low-carbon economy, into renewable energy and things. So people save via pensions, but they also save via banks, and this again is the UK. The blue bar at the bottom is how much banks actually lend to businesses, right? The rest is the other stuff banks do, and it's mostly into real estate. So I understand here a lot of the investment is in real estate, but the difference is in Britain it's in existing housing, whereas in Turkey you need more housing and banks lend into more housing. That's fine. But what's happening in Britain is that none of banks and pension funds don't actually invest in the economy. So this means that we don't have much of a future potential for growth, but we also we would find it very hard to invest at large scale in renewable energy, because we're not really investing at all. The other thing that what I called shareholder capitalism does is our pension funds own all our public companies, which is very different to what happens in Turkey. And it means the public companies, it's been shown, are run increasingly in the short term. And this is because of the incentives within the system, whereby investors are looking to get increasingly short-term returns. And so, for example, the companies are incentivized to pay their chief executives very highly, so that they will try linking their pay to the performance of their shares, and it means the chief executive get paid more and more, but the companies don't necessarily do any better. And also this graph shows the amount of money that public companies invest compared to the amount they give back to their shareholders. And you see the investment, since this philosophy has taken hold, US and British companies are more and more giving more and more money back to their shareholders, but are not investing at all. It's a time when we need investment into the low-carbon economy. So what's that got impact on climate change? Well, the finance system isn't really working at the moment in Anglo-Saxon countries, I'll say, because it's increasingly behaving in a short-term way, and it's returning funds to shareholders rather than investing at a time when we need to heavily invest in the low-carbon economy. And also, we need to shut down our high carbon, like things like coal, but companies tend to lobby to stop that happening. Right? But now Turkey, as I said, is in a very good position to actually put itself on a sustainable track with just small changes to its system. We like in Britain, America, actually also have an opportunity, and that opportunity comes from another angle, which is in 2008, as we know, there was a financial crisis, the banks collapsed. They're now massively regulated. They're not actually making much money. They're being challenged by new business models, for example, blockchain, high-frequency trading, passive asset management, new entrants like who are getting in on the banking space, like in China, Alibaba and Apple. And this gives the opportunity to rethink the way we do finance, because the current system is actually being replaced. And so how do we do that? Well, I say what we need to do is, when we think about how we get people to save, we need to think of what outcome we want. And the outcome, I think, is we need to finance sustainable growth, which means investing in things like health, clean environment, in prosperity and well-being of the population. That might sound idealistic, but that's actually what investment is for. And an example of solutions. So one is green bonds. So the idea here is that you create financial instruments that pension funds, for example, or large investors can invest in at scale, and the money that is invested in green bonds goes directly to a green technology, renewable energy investment. The market has, from nowhere, about 5 years ago, it's gone to 100 billion issuance. But the reason it's gone to that is there are quite a lot of investors who want to do good with their investment, their SRI investment. And soon, but to get the transformation we need at scale, we need to actually go beyond those investors. And the way you can do that is by governments preferencing green bond investments. So, for example, central banks can buy green bonds. You could have them seen as low risk in banks' solvency ratios, or if governments are giving, for example, like in Turkey, are giving people a large incentive to invest in their pension, you can say, well, the pension has to be invested in stuff like green bonds. Another example, more generally on pensions, is you think about what we need a pension to do. We need to be able to pay people a pension when they retire, but you also need the money, as I've been talking about in this talk, the money needs to be invested in something that gives sustainable growth. So how do we do that? Well, again, the governments should specify how they want that money spent. Now, I don't think they should specify, I want any money invested in a pension in my friend's company. What I mean by that is the free market should still work, but the asset categories that you can invest in are more limited to things like venture capitalism, new businesses, to things like sustainable infrastructure, or to companies which get scores of A on CDP, or slightly more detailed companies which have a high triple bottom line score. And finally, banks. So at the moment, I showed before that banks generally invest in real estate in Britain, in USA, in much of Western Europe. And the reason is that it's cheaper for them. It's not because they're bad or anything. It's cheaper for them to do so because of their solvency requirements, because mortgages on houses are seen as being low risk, right? That might be true that they're low risk on a micro scale, but it's not true on a macro scale. It's not good for the economy that most 90% of lending is into real estate. So we need sort of to split the banking sector into banks which just lend against real estate and banks which lend to into businesses, particularly sustainable businesses, and those could be given a lower risk weighting than into financial assets. Or the more radical alternative is actually we have a system of fractional reserve banking, but with the development of mobile money and electronic money, actually we could move to a different system whereby currency is issued by the government. Electronic currency is issued directly by the government, which is being discussed in Britain. I think the Swedish central bank is thinking about that, and that will actually totally change the nature of banks. It will turn them from what they are today into effectively like peer-to-peer lenders. Right. Well, I hope. I'm sorry about I speak in English badly as well and too quickly, so I hope you've managed to understand what I was saying. Next, if you invite me back next time, I'm going to do a crash course in Turkish and try and speak to you in Turkish. But thanks so much, first of all, to Garanti Bank and CDP for inviting me here, and I've very much enjoyed myself. Thanks.